Good evening. My name is Nik Gowing. I work in television, and you may sometimes see me on the BBC, but I'm here in a personal capacity. But more important is that the two guests we have this evening to talk about threats, just talking threats. All of you may have threats in your life, but what kind of threats? And what are the threats you don't really know about? Well, Michael Chertoff was Director of Homeland, or the Secretary for Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009. He's also, though, a lawyer. He's been a judge. He's been a prosecutor as well. He now runs his own security group and has been at the heart of some of the most difficult challenges, many of which we don't really know about. And we all are also joined by Bob Kandra. Now, he has worked at the CIA and the FBI, and he works now for the Chertoff Group, and therefore Michael is, I guess, his boss. But on the other hand, he does come to the table, or to this void here, with a significant background in activities which he can't really talk about. But I'm going to try, and just before I ask Michael to talk about the threats, given, Bob, that you talk about being a specialist in paramilitary and unconventional operations in high-threat regions, that sounds like a low-risk job. But what can you tell us about, in 1 minute, give us an idea of what you have done in your career so we know why you're sitting there.
Well, like many countries, the United States has officers people that join the clandestine service, and those people serve around the world, both in high-threat areas and war zones supporting U.S. military forces, as well as every other country. And we go and try to determine information to get the best intelligence and information back to the United States so that we can make the right decisions, either policy-wise or otherwise.
Do you feel uncomfortable talking in public now?
No, the latter part of my career, I worked closely with a lot of different foreign governments. So in that capacity, and especially when you're working with the U.S. military in places like Afghanistan, my affiliation with the CIA was open to all of our ISAF partners and to many NATO countries. And so that exposure alone means that we don't have to be as careful then afterwards. So.
Okay, but for example, MI6 talks about itself being as the secret intelligence service, and they say we're secret, so we're not going to tell you anything about us.
Yes, they say that.
But
I think that, especially here for tonight, but in general, the CIA openly recruits individuals inside the United States to come on board the clandestine service, and we talk about the type of career that you can have inside the agency. For me, and I think for a lot of agency personnel, it's a way of life. Because it's about the way that you interact with other people, about the way that you carry yourself, whether you're in the agency or even after you're retired.
So what we have in Bob is an operative, someone who's been there at very, very different levels, but we'd never known about before. But Michael Chertoff, being the Secretary for Homeland Security, has had to coordinate all of this, including the difficulty at times, Michael, of coordinating the CIA and the FBI, which did become a significant challenge for you in Homeland Security. But in the 40 minutes we have here, and I'd like you to feel you can engage. I'm just going to hear from Michael first of all, and then open it out, because you've probably got some better questions than I can put because of your perspective here. Tell us what you think the significant threats are, often threats which people don't realize are threats.
Yeah. So, threats obviously cover a lot of different issues. I won't discuss, for example, medical threats. You've been reading about this new virus in Saudi Arabia, the MERS virus. That's not something I'm going to talk about. Obviously, you have financial and economic issues, which people in this region are very familiar with. You have natural disasters. But I think what we're talking about here are human threats, things we worry about that would be intentionally caused by others. And I would say in the current environment in which we live, there are really three broad categories of what I consider to be the most serious near-term threats. First, terrorism remains a very serious threat. You didn't experience a 9/11 here, but certainly in the region there have been numerous attempts over the last decade or so to carry out terrorist attacks against a number of European countries. Obviously, the U.S. experienced the attack of September 11th, 2001. Since that time, we've built a much more capable intelligence and defense apparatus and security apparatus that has made it harder to carry out attacks, but it hasn't eliminated them. And what we've seen instead is a kind of a change or an adaptation in the way the terrorists try to carry out their missions against the West. And they still very much want to do that. First, we see that Al-Qaeda and similar groups, extremist groups, have spread out. They used to be centrally located more or less in Afghanistan, Pakistan, a little bit in Yemen. Now we've seen a metastasis of these groups so that they are a fairly significant presence in North Africa and East Africa, continuing to be in the Middle East, even in Southeast Asia. And then they continue to try to recruit Westerners, radicalize them, train them, and direct them to carry out attacks against the West. In the United States, about a year ago, we had the Boston Marathon bombing, where a couple of individuals who apparently became radicalized over the internet, may have had some relatives back in the Chechnya area, actually carried out a bombing and at the tail end or at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. We've had more serious efforts to attack in this region. In August 2006, there was a plot to blow up somewhere between 10 and 12 airliners leaving Heathrow Airport going to North America. That was happily frustrated. Had it been carried out, it would have been comparable to 9/11. And we still see attacks taking place around the globe for Westerners who travel in Africa or in the Middle East. We have kidnappings. Obviously, you're following what Boko Haram is doing with these poor, high school girls who've been kidnapped and they're threatening to sell them into slavery. So this remains a very, very big threat and an adaptable threat. A second threat that is a somewhat newer threat is the threat of cyber warfare and cyber attacks. And again, for a decade or two, we've been dealing with the issue of criminality in cyberspace and over the internet. And it's your same basic variety of fraud that we've always had since human beings first began to deal with each other. Identity theft, theft of information about bank accounts or identity card account numbers or similar types of purloining of information designed to allow people to basically steal money. There was, I guess in the last couple of years, there was a global scheme that was able in the space of a single day to download $40 million from ATM machines around the globe. Using a variety of cyber techniques, what they did is they adjusted the withdrawal limits on debit cards, and then they sent operatives out literally around the world to, within the space of a single day, withdraw a limitless amount of cash from automatic teller machines, $40 million. So that's obviously becoming a even more serious threat. But in addition to the threat of criminality, we have the theft of intellectual property. We have the theft of national security secrets. And emerging as a more recent issue is the use of cyber as a way of actually attacking physical institutions, disrupting the way they operate, trying to make it impossible, for example, to do online banking, interfering with government operations by flooding the internet with so much data that you basically break down the system because you exceed the bandwidth of the infrastructure. And now we even see the threat of cyber attacks on industrial control systems that could, in theory, turn off electricity, turn off water supplies, affect the way transportation operates, corrupt banking records. Is this merely a theoretical threat? Well, in 2007, many of you will know that Estonia was attacked from so-called activist hackers from Russia, and there was an effort made to overwhelm the government and financial sector computer infrastructure in order to basically paralyze the country. And the Estonians, with help from other countries and help from NATO, pushed back against that. In 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, that attack was accompanied by a cyber attack on the command and control system that the Georgians were using to deal with their military. And even now there's press reporting that in the face of the crisis in Ukraine, that the Russians have used their ability to compromise command and control systems of the Ukrainian government as a way of enabling or promoting the disruption of activities, particularly in eastern Ukraine. So I think this threat is going to become more and more of an issue. The final thing is the, of course, old-fashioned military threat. And I know people in Europe are accustomed to thinking of the days of conventional warfare as over with. You know, borders are now secure, we have an EU, we have NATO, war on the continent of Europe is over. But sadly, we have seen that that's not true. In the wake of the breakup of Yugoslavia, of course, we had a relatively modest level of warfare globally, but certainly significant regionally among the breakup states, Serbia, Croatia, Kosovo. More recently, of course, we see the annexation of Crimea and the crisis in the Ukraine. Now, is it going to be the same as we saw in past world wars with massed armies crossing borders? Probably not. But I think what we are seeing is an adaptation of warfare that is somewhere between irregular guerrilla warfare and covert operations on the one hand, and traditional military activity on the other. And I know Bob can talk a little bit about this. Sometimes it's called masked warfare, sometimes it's called active measures. And what it is the use of all the tools of state power as a way of disrupting and perhaps overturning the government of another state. It involves infiltrating people who are trained in special operations and having them pretend to be insurgents. It can involve elements of cyber activity. It can involve sending civilians in place to disrupt civilian mechanisms. It can involve information operations like propaganda designed to demoralize the country that you are attacking. It can involve cyber warfare. We see it in the Ukraine. We've seen in Asia, for example, the Chinese exerting themselves by declaring an air interception zone that broadens out beyond what it traditionally has been, or sending a flotilla of ships into the South China Sea in order to put a drilling rig. These are not conventional warfare, but they are part of a strategic effort to push your border out or to intrude into the border of another country using a wide variety of tools, some of them somewhat irregular, and also including, by the way, economic tools. I think this kind of threat is going to become much more of the way we see warfare conducted in the next decade or so. Not armies with flags, but a combination of tools. Everything from information, propaganda, cyber, and physical special operators, and even things like drones, all brought together strategically in order to either overthrow another government or to essentially decapitate or cripple a state so that the influence of the attacking state can be extended.
Both of you, what's the capacity of fraudsters and potential terrorists now to outsmart the state?
You know, in my view, I think that we have been quite effective at getting ahead of what the terrorists do. And we've made it very difficult for them to operate globally.
Fraudsters too?
Fraudsters too. That's a little harder in a way because we don't apply the same level of intelligence and state power against fraudsters that we do against terrorists, because from a national security standpoint, terrorism is viewed as the national obligation. Fraud is still viewed to some degree as the private sector has to protect itself. But I will tell you that terrorists, for example, have become quite skilled at bomb making. You know, years of improvising explosive devices in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen have created a group of people who are very, very good at putting bombs in places that you wouldn't suspect. There was a plot that became public a couple years ago to put bombs in printers and send those printers on cargo jets so they would explode at some point over the ocean. And they were quite cleverly disguised and not easy
One
to
did
determine.
at East Midlands Airport.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is a constantly evolving challenge.
How smart, Bob?
I would say that
Can I just check, where are the microphones here? Who's got the microphones? Who's got the microphones? Are there microphones somewhere, please? Could you mobilize them? Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Bob, sorry.
with regard to the terrorist threat, one thing that I think is really important to understand, most countries, including the United States, especially after 9/11, the security services, intelligence services, looked outward. So we looked for individuals that we believed would be the enemy trying to penetrate or to attack systems, aircraft, or attack the homeland, whether the homeland is Great Britain or the homeland is the United States or the homeland is Slovakia. One of the things that have changed is the concept that we call the lone wolf terrorist in the United States, and that's the individual that is self-identifying, self-recruiting. They recruit themselves over the internet. They're self-resourcing. They're able to acquire the components to be able to build a bomb themselves, a very effective one, and they're on their own timetable. Breivik, I think, in Norway, did an attack several years ago. It took him 2 years to plan it, and he killed almost 100 people. Inside the United States, the Tsarnaev brothers, they did travel some abroad and then back, but largely they self-radicalized inside the United States. So the real challenge for a lot of services is to identify that person that's never broken the law, they've never crossed any radar screen or tripwire that a security service or an intelligence service would have noticed. They've acquired materials slowly over time that aren't illegal to obtain, and then they've chosen a target that they themselves have picked, and they're not working off of a timetable that some greater power is giving them direction to do. So spotting that homegrown terrorist, and it's in every country, not just the United States, it's in every place because there is some motivating factor that's going to set someone off inside every place. The amount of damage they do is just limited to the amount of material they're able to acquire. So we're getting better at that, but balancing the protection of civil liberties and being able to do that at the same time is a huge challenge. Because up until the time they attack, there's not a single thing that brings them to the attention of law enforcement.
Not a single thing. Are you saying that now it's much more difficult to trace, that those who are successful are very good at hiding their tracks, their fingerprints, their digital tracks, and so on?
Actually, what's happened is this. Because we've gotten quite good using intelligence at detecting terrorist plots when they're significant plots, because there are people who have to communicate, they have to travel, they have to move money. What has happened is they've scaled the plots down. And so now there are fewer people involved. They tend not to travel or do a lot of communicating. But the good news is they tend to be less sophisticated plots, because to really carry out a 9/11, you have to have a lot of people involved. And if you're afraid to do that, and you only have 1 or 2 people, you'll get a Boston Marathon bombing or something like Nidal Hasan, who shot people at Fort Hood, Texas. But as bad as it is to kill 5, 10 people, it's not like killing 5,000 people. So that has forced them to scale the plots down to some extent.
Michael, can we just go to John Reed, Lord Reed, because you were Home Secretary, Interior Minister at a critical time, and I think there's an additional insight here about the political judgment that has to be made, because Michael referred to a multiple bombing attempt on up to 12 aircraft crossing the Atlantic, and the British Home Secretary at the time, Lord Reed, formerly John Reed, you had to make a very difficult political decision to shut Heathrow Airport and literally stop aviation, I think at about 10 o'clock one evening, and the airport was closed.
Yes, and some of the people in the audience today will be involved in politics or administration and so on, and they will perhaps in the near future, perhaps in the longer future, have to make such decisions. I think the most difficult decision was the balance between letting a plot of which you're aware. And by the way, when I was Home Secretary, we had about 60 terrorist plots under surveillance, some very big, some small. But letting it run in order to get the evidence that you need in a democracy to put away the people who are behind the plot, and on the other hand, the recognition that the longer you let it run, the greater the danger that they would actually be able to carry out the plot that they had. And that is a big, difficult decision. I think the second thing I would say is that a lot of people here are the first generation in history to actually teach their parents about the means of technology that runs society. That is cyber. Most generations, the parents teach the kids. And therefore, a lot of politicians find it difficult to understand exactly how important cyber and the internet and interconnections are. But if I give you just one example of it, if somebody wanted to attack Slovakia or anyone else with an intercontinental ballistic missile, it would take a huge amount of money for research, a huge amount of money for the missile, a huge amount of money for the warhead, and a huge amount of money for the platform, whether it's an artillery piece or a submarine that launched the missile. Nowadays, that could do it. The iPad could do it, and 40 different types of platform. Somebody else has done the research, somebody else has paid for all the money for the knowledge in the background, and sold platforms which could intervene with the systems that run the critical services for all of your lives. Michael mentioned this earlier. And therefore, the combination of cyber and small groups of terrorists, whether they're Islamist terrorists or other terrorists, is now available to not only states like Russia, which has used it in Georgia and Estonia and so on, but to small groups of people. I don't want to keep you awake at night worrying about it, but it has been the same with all form of technological advance. It can be used for good and for bad, and I think that the age group of people who are here today are much more capable of understanding that, Nick, than some older politicians who don't quite grasp the threats of cyber.
Let's move the microphone across, and while it moves across, if you could move across to this gentleman here. How much are states involved in these threats? You can name states if you want, but state-sponsored threats, whether it be cyber, whether it be other forms of what we're loosely calling some kind of terrorism.
Well, it used to be traditionally that terrorism was almost all state-sponsored if it got above a certain level. That has changed because, as John Reed said, it's now, technology has now given small groups of people and networks the ability to actually carry out significant attacks themselves. But you still do have state-sponsored terrorism. Iran, for example, sponsors Hezbollah, which is probably the most capable terrorist group in the world. As far as cyber goes, we haven't seen, obviously, states really involved in criminality in cyber, with maybe the possible exception of North Korea. But
Are the Chinese, though, close to the edge?
The Chinese, however, do engage, and this has been published in reports, do engage in economic espionage and theft of intellectual property using cyber means. And as I said earlier, there have been cyber attacks on Estonia and Georgia back in 2007, 2008. The Russian government has always denied being responsible for that, but one of the challenges of dealing with cyber is it's often difficult to attribute who actually is carrying out the attack. It's not necessary for the government of a state to own up to the fact it's attacking. They can simply, pretend or blame a bunch of independent actors. But I have to say there's a fair bit of reason to think there's at least tacit government encouragement on some of those attacks.
Yeah, I would say that the tacit part, if you look at a state, India has long accused Pakistan of allowing Lashkar-e-Taiba, an incredibly dangerous group, I think the most dangerous certainly in South Asia, to be able to safe haven or raise funds in Pakistan over the issue of Kashmir. So there are, other than Iran, I would say there are many states that provide, if you will, a free environment for groups to either raise funds, disseminate propaganda, find new recruits, do training in some cases. And while it may not be state-directed, that kind of symbiosis between the group and the country that's allowing it to operate, from my perspective, certainly is tantamount to support.
But there was a bit of reverse engineering which allowed the building of the Public Security Bureau in Shanghai, to be identified by name and by location
Yeah,
when there was a particular intervention.
Right. There was a private group called Mandiant put out a report last year that identified a single unit of the People's Liberation Army that had been responsible for a significant amount of hacking. Again, not destructive hacking, but stealing of intellectual property, but from a wide variety of enterprises. Businesses involved in the energy industry, obviously technology industries, but also newspapers. Apparently they were hacking into emails in order to figure out who the sources were for particular articles that were critical of the leadership in China. So this is public, it's on the internet. So there is pretty compelling evidence of state sponsorship.
Good evening, my name is Thomas.
Microphone, please.
Good evening, my name is Thomas Wezek, and I just wanted to ask a short question. You were mentioning the cyber threat and the cyber attacks that can be dangerous to the society and to the economics. On the other hand, we have still the persistent terrorist threat. Do you think that the current terrorist groups that are behind the bombing attacks will embrace the new technologies and will use cyber attacks in the future? Or should we be more afraid of new individuals and hackers, let's say, switching to terrorism and using cyber attacks as a tool for terrorism?
I think both. I think, again, the original group of people who led Al-Qaeda tended to gravitate to the idea of a big explosion, something with a lot of bodies. I think as you get into newer groups and newer leaders who are not wedded necessarily to the tactics of the past, you will see the use of cyber, particularly if they can cause an impact in the real world. Shut down an electric grid, interfere with the transportation system. On the other hand, you also have people who are not terrorists, but they're ideologically motivated to use cyberspace as a way of pushing back against people they disagree with. They typically won't be destructive, but what they will do is try to steal information, personal information, which is, you can now upload and put on the internet, and you can show where, somebody lives or get information from their personal emails, which they can use to embarrass somebody. So, the more we transact business and the more we control our physical world through the internet, the greater the temptation there'll be for people from a variety of motivations to actually use that as a way of causing a real world impact.
There's a group called the Syrian Cyber Army, which is not a group that's been built by the Syrian government, but they themselves they're certainly empathetic with Syria and the regime of al-Assad, but they were part of some major denial of service attacks against the U.S. financial sector about a year and a half ago. So there are groups that don't have to be what we consider, state-sponsored or requires great technology. These may be 5 guys sitting in the basement of an apartment in Damascus that feel as though the United States is an antipathy toward the government of al-Assad, so they're going to create themselves a cyber army and attack some of the largest banks in New York. So that's already happened. Will that next generation do that? Some of the people fighting in groups that are disparate now that are empathetic with what Al-Qaeda were teenagers at 9/11. So they're very computer literate, and they think along those lines.
They even announced that Obama had been assassinated, and the market went down a massive amount and then bounced back. Please, we've got 5 minutes to run. Who's got the mic?
Matthias Bange, I'm here with the Young Leaders Forum. My question actually concerns financial warfare too. The US in very recent years has been using it to coerce rogue actors like Iran or North Korea. Do you think there's actually a risk that backfires and is turned against the US by financially potential states or actors around the world?
Well, there is a view that countries tend to be inhibited about engaging in cyber attacks on the financial system because everybody uses the same system. There is a risk that when you impose sanctions, and sometimes there's a very good reason to do that, but there's a risk that when you impose sanctions, if you really exclude somebody from the financial system, that they will then become motivated to actually damage the system. There was an attack on Saudi Aramco, the oil company in Saudi Arabia, a couple of years ago. Again, it was publicly I think publicly the view was taken that it was probably Iranian sympathizers, and it was a reaction to the sanctions against Iran. So we may see some of that asymmetric warfare now affecting our banking and our financial system.
Can I take a couple more quickly, Daniela? Be generous. Please?
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm from Australia. Just going back to what you were speaking about before on the balance between civil liberties and security in light of recent events over the last year or so. I'm just wondering what your views are on the limits to surveillance in that context.
And could you just add, given what Lord Reed said about the difficulty he had that night of making that very difficult judgment, letting it run, but also making sure there was actionable evidence which could stand up in a court of law, how the legal framing currently allows actionable action to be taken against those who are planning, and how much that's a restriction on you?
Yeah, I mean, so at least in the United States, I know the law is different in every country, all surveillance taken domestically has to be authorized or at least generally approved by a court. And it's very restricted in terms of what you need to do to get from the most kind of basic minor surveillance to something more significant. We then allow that evidence, provided it has been properly authorized, to be used in court. And so we've had cases like with one of the two Boston Marathon bombers will actually be tried sometime this year for the bombing there. So we do have a pretty well developed system for using the courts both to authorize and review surveillance and intelligence collection, but also then to allow that evidence to be used in a court proceeding subsequently.
What about the legal framing, though, when you look at elsewhere in the world?
Well, you know, as not surprisingly, the rule when you're conducting intelligence overseas is it's a much different legal requirement. It's a much lower legal requirement. That's true of every country. By definition, an intelligence agency is in the business of obtaining information that another country doesn't want to divulge. That means you're probably breaking the law. And so, you know, during the Cold War, for example, if we were spying on the Soviet Union, I'm sure it violated Soviet law, but that was not a deterrent. Or right now, if we're trying to figure out what Assad is going to do, we're not going to worry that Assad would want to prosecute us. So there's a different standard. Even there are some legal rules about what you can do and you can't do, though.
Quick question, FBI and the CIA, the fact is they didn't talk to each other very well, and Obama had to get heads banged together after a particular incident. Are they talking to each other better now? In other words, are they sharing information? Do they have the same database? Bob?
Yeah, the FBI
Really?
and the...
Really?
Absolutely. The FBI and the CIA, two very specific things that they did, not only immediately post 9/11, but certainly, and Director Mueller was absolutely committed to this. And that was that the FBI still is, and always has been, what I believe to be the best law enforcement organization in the world. And they were great at investigating crimes after they occurred, but not necessarily anticipating crimes before they take place. And the FBI has changed to be an intelligence-led, intelligence-driven organization to try to anticipate those type of crimes. That mindset change inside the FBI has been a painful process. It's one that they're still undergoing, but it brings them to a greater commonality of language with the CIA, which is exclusively focused on intelligence collection. The sharing of information in databases, very interestingly, didn't initially flow out of the terrorist realm, but flowed out of the cooperation taking place on counterintelligence issues. And now in the terrorist realm, we exchange personnel, and like I served over there, and I'll tell you that I've never seen it as good as it is now. So that is definitely a cultural shift in both organizations.
Do they really talk to each other, Michael?
Yes, actually, we had a very good relationship when I was there.
But you were trying to run, 180,000 people at one point, weren't you?
But the Bureau was separate, but we actually had a very good working relationship. Yeah, it worked out very well.
Good. All right, well, thank you very much indeed. You've just got an idea of what is going on, what the challenges are, but really what the major difficulties and complications are, particularly as we enter this amazing digital space. Who controls it? Who's going to oversee it? Who's going to provide the right framework to at least allow us to capture both data and also track down those who are threatening us? Michael Chertoff.
Thank you, Nick.
Bob,
Thanks.
thank you very much indeed.
Indeed, sir. Thank you.